wish I could tell you more of the nice things that I know about Dr. Cruzen, but I know you want to hear him, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say myself. He's going to talk about the application of physical medicine, particularly the rehabilitation element of it, in the elderly. The exact title escapes me, Frank, but that's essentially it, isn't it?
Thank you, Lau, for that very kind and generous introduction. When I hear an introduction like this, I only wish that my wife was here to hear it, because she doesn't seem always to appreciate me as much as I should like. Dean Burkhardt mentioned this morning, he was describing a dean, as most of you heard, and said that the president of the university was called the shepherd of the flock, and that the dean was called, as the shepherd's staff, the dean was the crook of the staff. This reminded me of, I once, Dean Burkhardt was an associate dean of Temple Medical School for 10 years, and I always used to laugh at the definition of Ernest Irons of Chicago, who had been an associate dean, as I was, and he said an associate dean is a mouse learning to be a rat. I was thinking when George Davis spoke at lunchtime today and told some of his very delightful stories of the story that is attributed to Adlai Stevenson about the minister who was walking down the street, and he met one of his rather beautiful lady parishioners who unfortunately had a very, very bad reputation for morals. So he said to her, "You know, young lady, I prayed for you for 3 hours last night." And she said, "Well, why did you do that? Why didn't you just call me on the telephone and I'd come right over?" Well, when Lau called me on the telephone and asked me if I would come to speak to you, I said I'd be glad to come on over. There's one other story I like to tell. This is one of the bad qualities of we older people. We tell the same stories over and over again. And right now I'm glad that my wife is not here, because if I were, she wouldn't let me tell this story because I've told it too frequently before. It's the story about the international course given during World War II for the waves of the various armies of the various navies of the world. This was given by a British group in a London setting. And after these women from the various navies of the world had been given this course in survival, the little British sergeant who was conducting the course said, "Now, in order to see whether you've understood and appreciated our instructions, I'm going to give you a hypothetical problem. Let us presume that you were assigned to a ship in your particular navy, and the ship was sunk, and you found yourself the sole survivor in a small boat with a pair of oars, but no food and no water. And you rowed for 24 hours, and you saw no land, and you were becoming very hungry and thirsty. And then you rowed another 24 hours, and you were completely exhausted, starving, and very, very thirsty. And finally you saw some land. And I think I can compete with the music in the distance. Can you hear me over it? I have a rather foghorn voice. You saw some land, he said, but when you got close to it, you saw it was a small island on which there were some 90 young sailors with plenty of food and plenty of water, but they hadn't seen a woman for 60 days. What would you do? Well, the British wave said, I think I would turn around and row away as fast as I could. And the American wave said, well, I think I'd be awfully hungry and thirsty. I think I'd land, but I'd take an oar with me to protect myself. And the French wave said, well, I understand the situation, but what is the problem? Well, now we do have some very complicated problems in dealing with the four-generation family, which has been discussed so ably by my friends Clark Tibbetts and Wilma Donahue today. And I want to talk about this. It's really a great honor for me to be here to participate in this 10th Memorial Workshop on Aging and to pay my respects to my old friend Nyla Kirkpatrick Kowalt, and I'm also honored to participate in the program with my two old friends Clark Tibbetts and Wilma Donahue. This theme of this year's workshop, the four-generation family in modern America, is one with which I find myself in great personal sympathy. In Dean Burkhart's communication to me before I came, he mentioned that your group here has been impressed with the fact that there appear to be more and more individuals who, retiring at the age of 65, find themselves supporting parents who are 80 to 85 years of age, and at the same time these 65-year-old people have 40-year-old children and teenage grandchildren. Dean Burkhart concluded, it seems to us that this phenomenon has some special implications for us all. I suddenly stopped to think and found that I myself was in this situation. Last June, I reached the so-called retirement age of 65 at the Mayo Clinic, and I find myself now in a home where my wife and I are living with a 93-year-old mother-in-law and a 30-year-old daughter who's staying with us while she does some graduate work at the university. And when I left my home yesterday, we were entertaining two teenage grandchildren of my 37-year-old daughter. Often now we will find in families two generations, both great-grandparents and grandparents, who may require medical rehabilitation in order to keep them physically, mentally, socially, and vocationally as self-sufficient as possible. Medical rehabilitation can never be separated from the total scheme of a disabled person's life. This is true of any disabled person, but especially so in the case of the elderly victim of chronic illness or physical disability. The purely physical aspect of a person's disability cannot be dealt with in isolation from the rest of his life. For the younger patient, the onset of disability creates the corollary problems of physical and economic dependency, housing, and recreation. However, in the case of the elderly person, these problems are often already present, even in the absence of an incapacitating or catastrophic disability. Typically, the problems of where and with whom to live, how to support and care for oneself, how to spend one's leisure time are the inevitable consequences of reaching advanced age in our society. Severe chronic illness or disability merely intensifies these problems. The very process of medical rehabilitation is the process of adjusting the patient, his family, and his environment to a disability. This is quite different from the process of managing a patient having a single self-limiting condition which would allow him to return to his normal environment. Hence, medical rehabilitation must deal with the patient within the framework of his total personal, social, and physical environment. In the case of our elderly patients, this environment is less easy to manipulate and less capable of adjustment than in the case of the younger patient. The younger patient is usually in the mainstream of life, with a family and perhaps an employer eager to welcome him back and actively helping him to make his way back. Unfortunately, this is not always the case when we're dealing with the elderly patient. In medical rehabilitation of the aging, the physician is called upon to fulfill a traditional but frequently neglected responsibility, that of providing personal counsel and even moral leadership to the families he serves. I say this because the successful rehabilitation of the aging calls for the acceptance of certain cultural attitudes or moral responsibilities by the family and by society. One of these attitudes is that the elderly person, if at all possible, should be allowed to remain in the home or in the community where he raised his children, or in the home of the children he raised, or in an environment as much as possible like the one in which his earlier years were passed. Should rehabilitation seek to restore him to these surroundings? At a news conference right after lunch today, Clark Tibbetts, Wilma Donahue, and I were discussing this problem, and Clark came up with the idea that not all old people want to live in their old home. Many of them like to live in a small and convenient apartment. A good percentage, he said. But I said, now, Clark, I'd like to clear up one point. You don't think that this apartment or this community for older people should be down in Florida or California. You think it should be right here in downtown Muncie if it's a Muncie individual. And he agreed that this is the case. It is true that older people, many of them, are willing to move from an old and large house, although many are reluctant to a small and convenient apartment in a group with other older people. But they still want to stay, usually, almost invariably, in their own community, where their children live, where their friends live, where they have grown up, rather than go off to some utopia in the sunny climes under the palm trees. It's awfully nice to think about retiring and going fishing. But when I reached retirement age, I decided that fishing was only fun when you can get away from work to do it, and it'd be awfully damn tiresome to do every day. And I couldn't become enthusiastic about retiring and going fishing, much as I like to fish. Now, then, should rehabilitation efforts seek to restore the elderly person to, or keep him in his surroundings? Secondly, medical rehabilitation calls for a fervent belief in the intrinsic worth of the human being, regardless of his physical abilities and regardless of his potential usefulness. Rehabilitation calls for enormous expenditures of money and time, infinite patience, and time-consuming effort. Is the disabled elderly person worth the investment? These are the questions that must ultimately be answered by individual families, by our government, and by our local communities, and by the medical profession. To be sure, our society professes a belief in the value of the aged person, but our belief has never been tested to the degree to which it will be in the coming years, when the aged dependent will be no longer a rarity, but a reality in millions of families. The future course of medical rehabilitation will be determined by how our society meets this test. We must remember that in medical rehabilitation, we're not dealing with the old person wreathed with silver hair and benignity, whom we find idealized in sentimental paintings and poetry. We're dealing with old people who may be cantankerous, mentally unstable, incontinent, unable to bathe themselves, feed, or dress themselves. Medical rehabilitation confronts society with the stark and inescapable necessity to demonstrate how it really feels about old people. For example, at the American Congress of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation last year, year before last, Nyla and I attended this meeting. Dr. Victor Cummings of the Montefiore Hospital in New York presented a report on the elderly disabled amputee. He described the expensive, time-consuming, and difficult process of prosthetic fitting and training of such patients, fitting them with an artificial limb and training them to use it. In his discussion, he made this very significant observation on the practical feasibility of such a procedure when, after all this expense of time and money, the elderly amputee might actually remain ambulant for only a brief period of time. I quote from his statement, "Financial consideration might be raised, but how can we put a monetary value on even 6 months of comfort, dignity, and self-sufficiency in an aged individual who has spent many months in a hospital relying on others for his every need?" Dr. Cummings concluded, based on his studies, the elderly unilateral below-knee amputees, the unilateral above-knee amputees, and the bilateral below-knee amputees, both lower legs gone, including those having serious associated medical conditions, should be given every consideration for possible use of an artificial limb. Bear in mind that this specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation was referring to amputees ranging in age from 60 to 70 years with serious complicating conditions such as hemiplegia, heart disease, diabetes, or tuberculosis. According to purely utilitarian standards, what could be more futile and unrewarding than applying these expensive restorative techniques to such patients? Yet, medical rehabilitation, as personified by Dr. Cummings, says, yes, these patients are worthy of all of our skill and devotion. And I hope if I ever get into such a situation that I fall in the hands of such a physician. This is why I say that medical rehabilitation challenges our society by its unswerving determination to maintain the elderly disabled patient at his maximal level of independence and dignity. Our society is now faced with the need for providing treatment and rehabilitation facilities which correspond to the needs of our aging population. Our present system is clearly inadequate to these needs. The over 65 age group is the prime target for diseases which are by nature chronic and disabling. These include heart and vascular diseases, mental illness, arthritis, degenerative diseases, blindness, and hearing impairment. However, our medical facilities are linked to a philosophy which, for the most part, recognizes only two conditions: the curable and the incurable. This was pointed out by my friend Dr. Herman Hilleboe, the health officer of the state of New York. Herman made these remarks before the annual meeting of the Middle States Public Health Association in Minneapolis last year. He said, "The main defect is that we have not geared our resources to the medical care problems of today. Our older people are struck by heart diseases, cancer, strokes, and other chronic diseases. For these afflictions, they often need to go to the hospital for intensive care during the acute phase of their illness. But once the acute phase of the illness is over, they require prompt rehabilitation. In addition," he said, "many of them need long periods of convalescence where less intensive care is required. It's wasteful to lump all of these phases into one hospital. Often it's worse than wasteful, it's downright harmful to the patient's welfare." End of my quotation from Dr. Hilleboe. At the other extreme, from the general or acute hospital, we have the institution dedicated to purely passive care, the custodial or terminal facility, which is a mere way station to the grave. It's an abnegation of our professed belief in the value and dignity of the older person. Currently, there are some 17 million persons over the age of 65 in the United States. Approximately 5% of this number is relegated to institutions, the majority of which are custodial facilities. Background data compiled for the 1960 White House Conference on Aging revealed the following facts. There are about 25,000 nursing homes in the United States, containing about 500,000 beds. 180,000 of these beds are in what are called skilled nursing homes. 80,000 are in personal care homes that provide some skilled nursing care. The remainder of the beds, of these 500,000 beds, are in personal care homes without any skilled nursing care. Less than half of the occupants of these homes can walk without assistance. Further, the report stated, care given in most nursing homes and homes for the aged is limited primarily to nursing and custodial care with no restorative or rehabilitative services. As a result, the great majority of the people in these homes deteriorate physically and mentally to the point of total disability. There's now an anticipated need for 350,000 additional nursing home beds based on the expected increase in our geriatric, our aging population during the next 20 years. Surely, we cannot allow this prediction to come to pass. How can we invalidate these statistical projections? First, we must renounce the habit of discussing the problems of the aging in terms of future needs for nursing home beds. We must concentrate, I believe, instead upon the question of how to keep our aging population out of these beds. As I've stated before, we must give less emphasis to habitation and more to rehabilitation. How can we give our aging citizens the ability to live outside of the hospital and outside of the custodial and terminal facility? And failing this, how can we give them the ability to live with greater dignity and independence and self-respect and hope inside these institutions? Let us never forget that there are varying degrees of disability. It's not all black and all white, not curable, incurable. There are varying degrees, or perhaps it would be better to say varying degrees of independence, each affording its own measure of human comfort and dignity. There's a great difference between being independent and being dependent in such activities, simple activities as bathing, dressing, eating, and transferring from bed to chair, or from chair to toilet seat, or chair to bathtub. Initially, rehabilitation is more costly than ordinary institutional care. In the long run, however, it's considerably less expensive. Rehabilitation may take weeks or months, sometimes many months, but passive institutional care can go on and on indefinitely until death. The long-range economies which can be affected through rehabilitation of our seriously handicapped older people were well illustrated in the San Mateo, California study reported in 1961. In this community, a group of aging citizens was given thorough physical examinations at the time they first applied for welfare assistance. Half of these applicants received rehabilitation, corrective surgery, artificial limbs, physical and occupational therapy, and other restorative services. The program was financed by welfare funds. Initially, the cost of supplying these services greatly increased welfare expenditures. However, 5 years later, it was found that the total medical care bill for this group was 10 times lower than for the group which did not receive rehabilitation. In New York, intensive medical, psychologic, social, and economic evaluation of 95 chronically ill hospital patients showed that only 7 were in need of continuing hospitalization. 11 were judged to have better than 50-50 prospects of successful rehabilitation. These studies suggest that early initiation of rehabilitation services can keep many patients out of the nursing home or defer the need for this type of care. Rehabilitation also has an important and largely unfulfilled function to perform inside of the nursing home. The full utilization of rehabilitation concepts and techniques could do much to vitalize our nursing homes and to transform passive custodial care to active and dynamic service. We've progressed a long way from the attitude which regards the nursing home as, I've mentioned, as a way station to the grave. At the same time, rehabilitation has progressed far beyond the stage where its exclusive object is re-employment of persons having a vocational potential. Medical rehabilitation is moving toward the establishment of a new spectrum of services for the elderly disabled patient. Its purpose is to bridge the gap between the general hospital and the custodial facility, and to maintain the patient at his maximal degree of independence over the course of his remaining years. The first stage is the rehabilitation facility operating within the general hospital. At the Jewish Hospital in St. Louis, I just a year ago made a survey of the rehabilitation needs in the city of St. Louis. I found that Dr. Franz Steinberg was studying the ability of geriatric patients, older patients, to live at home. In this program, intensive rehabilitation is carried on simultaneously with intensive medical care for acute conditions. Of 43 patients studied in this program, 30 were returned to their homes, with the exception of those who died or suffered a new episode of acute disease. These patients were still at approximately the same level of adjustment after 1 year. In this respect, the Federal Community Health Service and Facilities Act of 1961 contains a highly significant amendment which modifies the definition of a rehabilitation facility as it applies to eligibility for Hilberton funds for support. This was pointed out by Surgeon General Luther Terry in an address to our Congress of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation 2 years ago. Formerly, Luther Terry said, such facilities were required to provide evaluation and services of 4 types: medical evaluation, psychologic, social, and vocational. The new definition calls for the provision of medical services plus 1 of the other 3. Dr. Terry emphasized that, quote, a major purpose of this amendment was to make Hilberton funds available for building and equipping more physical medicine and rehabilitation departments in hospitals. And he predicted that the pattern of the future will combine a small number of comprehensive rehabilitation facilities for the state with a larger number of local, medically oriented, non-comprehensive facilities. A second step toward bridging the gap between the general hospital and the custodial facility is the establishment of home care programs. New York's Montefiore Hospital has done some of the early pioneering work in this field. A group from this institution made the following interesting comment on some of their findings. Who indeed could have predicted that patients apparently incapable of rehabilitation in the hospital would attain major rehabilitation goals in the seemingly less favorable home setting? Nonetheless, for some of our patients, such has been the course of events. The opportunity to hold on to things physically has its psychological equivalent. More than one elderly patient able to maintain his orientation at home has collapsed into confusion in the hospital setting. In the area of home care, the Community Health Services and Facilities Act of 61 again offers positive opportunities for action. This act expanded the Public Health Services program of matching grants to states for serving the chronically ill. It also provided for new project grants to improve community health services with special emphasis on the chronically ill and the aged. Both programs stress out of hospital services. Whereas in the past, states received $1 for each 3 of federal funds for general health programs, the Public Health Service can now allow increased appropriation for programs specifically dedicated to the chronically ill and the aged. I always think when I discuss these projects of federal expenditures that, as it says in Reader's Digest this month in one of the little squibs, always remember when we recommend that the U.S. government pay for something, that U.S. spells us. And I think we must remember that this is the case. I remember the statement of my good friend Bernard Baruch, the great philanthropist, who wrote a little note to a group of high school students out in Iowa who asked him to send a message at their graduation. And I remember one sentence. He said, "Remember, your government is the greatest in the world, but don't lean too heavily on it." I think when we can, we should do these things as much as we can at the local level. At the end of the spectrum of services for elderly disabled patients lies this custodial facility. But once more, the introduction of medical rehabilitation services is demonstrating that patients can be maintained at the maximal degree of independence and dignity with a little aid by qualified rehabilitation nursing and rehabilitation nursing techniques. The results of a program reported by Dr. David Rubin of the Mount Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles are most heartening in this respect. Dr. Rubin's experience was gained in an institution which was literally converted from a custodial hospital to a dynamic rehabilitation center. The results of this program suggest that many of the patients admitted for custodial care can, with intensive medical rehabilitation, return home or be maintained at a high degree of independence in an institution. To summarize then, medical rehabilitation is demonstrating that the elderly disabled person is capable of attaining varying degrees of independence short of complete custodial care. Medical rehabilitation is demonstrating on a small scale what can be done and what should be done. The question of what will be done rests with individual families and with our voluntary and our governmental agencies. The answer will be based upon the depth and sincerity of our society's belief in the value and dignity of the aged individual. It's significant that many of the studies that I have cited to you this evening have been conducted under the auspices of Jewish organizations. It's probably not surprising that much of the pioneering work in this field has been encouraged by a cultural group with a strong and deep-lying tradition of family-centered care of the aging and with an unquestionable veneration for the aged. This emphasizes the assertion that our ultimate response to the needs of the aging will spring from the personal values and beliefs of our society. I believe that it's the duty of the medical profession, especially those physicians engaged in rehabilitation of the aging, to counsel and guide families in a way that will encourage them to live up to the highest humanitarian ideals of our society. I always like to quote the definition of rehabilitation which was given by my good friend Mary Switzer, the head of our Federal Vocational Rehabilitation Administration. She said that rehabilitation is a bridge spanning the gap between uselessness and usefulness, between hopelessness and hopefulness, between despair and happiness. Thank you.